All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on wherever you are joining us from in the world. Right now, it is a beautiful, balmy 1 million degrees here in Fredericton, New Brunswick. My name is Lee Thomas, and I am the host of this Facebook Live podcast called Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk is, like I mentioned, a Facebook Live sort of video podcast interview situation where I interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things relating to mental health. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm really glad that we haven't scared you off, and I'm hoping that this episode will not do that as well. So I'm really, really excited for today's episode. Today we have an incredible guest joining us. So Todd Leader is a mental health and addictions consultant. He's a psychologist. He's a social worker. He's got all sorts of accolades. He's got a book out called It's Not About Us. So we're just going to talk about all sorts of stuff. And Todd, there you are. Welcome to Crazy Talk. I'm really excited to have you today.
Oh, it's going to be fun. Glad to be here, Lee.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to kind of start off by asking, like, a lot of people, work in the mental health field, and a lot of people, are passionate about mental health, but not a lot of people have the gall, I might say, to kind of write a book and say, hey, the system isn't working as well as it could be. So can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to do that? Why did you do that?
Well, I've got a long history of working in the formal healthcare system in leadership roles, and getting to see the way things work and the way things don't work, and being part of the problem. In fact, over lots of years, and doing things the way they're normally done. Making decisions based on the kind of criteria that normally guide decisions, like politics and money and public relations and keeping a good corporate image of the health authority and all those things that guide so much of the management decisions. And so I spent a lot of time in addictions and some time in mental health as well. And I realized that many of the problems that the public are constantly having to advocate about and fight against and complain about in the media, they're not related to the care of people. They're related to the system. And so anyway, I started trying to use my insights that I gained from being an insider in the system, trying to use that to actually change the system. And I was fortunate to be supported, and I managed to lead a transformation that was really very remarkable. And when I left the health system, I decided that other people needed to know that kind of, the insider's insight. That's really what this book is. It's because everybody's looking at the system saying, we need to fix it. And I think this is what's needed. And I think this is what's needed. But I'm coming from inside saying, inside the box, when you open up the roof and take a look at what really happens inside there, it's not what people think.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is not what people think. And so I'm trying to kind of expose the reality of what happens inside, so that we can get to the root of the problem.
Yeah. So you alluded to kind of the transformation that you talked about. And so that was the transformation, on the South Shore in Nova Scotia. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, because I'm hoping everyone who's tuned in has read your book. And if they haven't, they should. This is my official endorsement. But for those of them who are watching, I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what that transformation was?
Sure. Well, we had the same problems as everybody else. We were one district in the province of Nova Scotia, and we had 9 at the time, and we had the same problems, and the public was disillusioned, the same as everybody across the country, about things like wait times and access issues, and not feeling like the system respected them or valued them, and frustrated with the fact that you have to wait until you're sick enough in order to qualify for services. And so, you wait until you're in crisis, and the system then tries to respond. All the same frustrations. I mean, you hear this from across the country. We all do, right? And if you scan the media across Canada, you will find exactly the same stories over and over again. And so we had that, and I started thinking about what it is we need to change, and we use terms like client-centered all the time, and every health authority, every mental health program, every health organization uses some version of that: people-centered, client-centered, person-centered, patient-centered. We've got all that, and it all sounds lovely, and it looks great on a plaque in the wall in the lobby of the hospital. But do we do it? That's the question. Do we do it? And if you ask most people out there, they'd say, well, we don't. And when you look at the healthcare system saying, we offer people-centered care or person-centered care, most people would call that bullshit. And it's because that's not what they experience. And so anyway, so we started the process of trying to walk through, how would we make this truly client-centered? Not just once somebody is sitting with a social worker or a psychologist or with a nurse, not just the care being compassionate, but all the rest of it. And so we started walking through the client's progress, kind of like from the time somebody says, I'd like to, I need help. I need to try and find help, or I need to find help for my son, or what do? Well, they start to look for a phone number, then they call, then they get an appointment, then they get in. And so we walked through all those pieces and tried to create a client-centered version of those pieces of the process. And I discovered along the way some particular methods that actually work to help a team get to that point, to figure out what really is client-centered.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for people to hear that, because we were talking about this a little bit backstage, but just because a lot of the times people see these systems as being almost set in stone, you know what I mean? Or like, if not set in stone, so big and so complex that they're just immovable, right? Like the system, I think a lot of people would agree that, the care that people are getting can be really, really fantastic. There are amazing helpers working in the system, but the system itself is not necessarily setting people up for success. And, people are often saying, the system is broken and that sort of thing, but it's sometimes said in kind of a throwing our hands up in the air and, the system is broken, what can you do about it sort of way,
yeah.
And finding that hope, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Or you'll hear people within the system, working in the system. I've heard this a million times. I've probably said it myself over my very long career, because I'm as old as God practically. But is phrases like, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way the system works. I mean, how often have we heard those kinds of lines? That's the way the system works. And, we can't just throw all that away. The system has to function in a predictable kind of way. And this is the way it is. And well, that's, not true. I mean, that's the way the system is, but it doesn't mean that it's the way the system has to be, I don't know. I have a kind of a philosophy. I sign it sometimes in people's books. It's a little line that I've been using, and that is never accept the status quo unless it's perfect. And of course it can never be. So That's why I love that line. There's always something that can be improved. So find it. Tweak it, and whether it's big changes or little changes, if it's in the direction of making it truly about the client, then it's progress.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, one of the things that also really resonated with me when I was reading your book is this idea of, helping healthy people stay healthy, right? And that's a huge piece that is missing from so many different systems and so many different services. I know my experience is more with like post-secondary institutions and schools and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I would often say, when I was at conferences or speaking or whatever, I was like, we spend so much time putting out fires that we're not spending any time making people fireproof, right? Or even, stopping whatever is setting all these people on fire, right? Yeah. Because we're so busy just putting out the people who are on fire, and I think that's a big, I think maybe paradigm shift, even for people working in the system, because I do feel like a lot of people feel that if I'm spending 100% of my time putting out fires, like, Todd, you are asking too much of me to also need to be fireproofing people.
Absolutely. I spent my career putting out fires. I mean, because in leadership roles, that's what you do. Whenever something goes wrong, if you're the manager, if you're the director, if you're the VP, that's what you do. You put out the fires. And so you spend so much time doing that. All you're doing is maintaining the status quo in the system, instead of looking at those things and saying, well, how did that happen? And how do we prevent that in future? Well, so when it comes to the issues of people's level of health or illness, we have a really huge systemic problem in that our system is designed specifically to treat sick people. That's it. But I mean, we have evidence now that tells us there are ways that we could prevent those people from having become sick to begin with. This one never became so salient for me as it did after I wrote this book. I mean, I've spent my life advocating for health promotion and real preventative public policy and things like that we know actually prevent addictions and mental illness. But after I wrote the book and it went up on Amazon, and I was never an author before, so this was a new thing. I'm just a kid from Glace Bay and Cape Breton, and so I see this thing on Amazon. It's got my name on it. Oh my God, I wrote that. I'm on Amazon, right? And it was like, that's freaking cool. So anyway, and so a day or two later, of course, I was looking at it every day because it was pretty cool, like a kid at Christmas. And anyway, but somebody wrote a review of it, because on Amazon or Chapters, you can write a review of a product. And this person wrote a review, and it was a scathing. It tore it apart, and it crushed me at first, right? And anyway, so a couple days later, a couple weeks later, I don't know, I went back and read it again. And when I read it the second time, I saw something that made me realize this person was actually supporting one of the premises of my book and didn't know it. So I won, because there was a line in there. The line said, Mr. Leader's ideas might work well in a community counseling center, but the mandate of the mental health and addiction program in Nova Scotia is to treat the severely and persistently mentally ill. And I thought, oh my God, thank you. That's the flaw in the system, is that it's designed only to treat people who are already severely mentally ill and, or already have addictions, full-blown addictions. And that's wrong. We would never do that with any other health condition. So if you imagine, for instance, which you can't imagine, you're too young for this, but if you can imagine, having somebody my age, for instance, starting to kind of not feel right. I go for a checkup with the doctor. Doctor checks my blood glucose level and finds that my sugar level's up a little bit higher than it should be. So it's not high enough to diagnose yet as diabetes, as type 2 diabetes, but it's higher than it should be. And so then imagine the doctor says to me, okay, so looks like you might be starting to develop diabetes. So go home, make an appointment for about a year from now, and by then I should be able to diagnose you with diabetes and treat you. That would never happen. That would be ridiculous. Yeah. And I mean, what would happen now? The doctor would say to you, you've got to lose some weight, you've got to exercise more, you've got to cut down on your carbs. That's what would be told. That's what you'd be told, because that in fact would probably reverse the problem and keep you healthy without diabetes. Which means you're then not somebody who becomes a chronic illness burden on the system, even from a financial perspective. Even if you take it from a cold financial perspective, telling me to get my shit together and reverse that effect is keeping a healthy person healthy. But we don't do that. Somebody has early symptoms of sadness that are lasting a little bit long, but they're not diagnosable with depression. What do? Well, we don't give them access, because you're not sick enough. And so we send them away, and we're kind of to wait. Well, what happens when you wait? Well, with any chronic illness, with virtually all illnesses, waiting makes them worse. And so then eventually you'll be sick enough and you'll be able to show up in an emergency department and you'll be in crisis, and that's what they do best. That's what the system is designed for. So good for you. You qualify now. It's wrong. It's an ethical problem for me in terms of it being a public system. It's an ethics problem for me.
Yeah, in my experience, it's also, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is maybe not like at an individual level, but at a systemic level, it's also an empathy problem, is kind of what I found, is this like, if someone is sad because of a specific situation, like, I work with youth a lot, and youth have a lot of problems that people brush aside, right? Because they're young. Like, it's like, oh, they're going through a breakup, or they're really stressed about an exam, or their parents are splitting up, or whatever it is. And it's kind of like, well, you're young and you need to be more resilient, as opposed to, and I mean, resilience, there's an interesting conversation to be had there, but it to me never seems like a very empathetic response. It's like we save the empathy for the people who are really, really sick, when giving empathy early would be so important.
Absolutely. And we've got a ton of evidence to support what you're describing, both in the area of resilience and in the area of social and emotional learning, right? So social and emotional learning implemented in the elementary schools at a school-wide level, we know that it actually prevents addiction, prevents mental illness, increases grades, and reduces aggressive behaviors among kids, like bullying. So are we doing that in all schools across the country? No. And so that's a problem when we know this will actually reduce the burden on our system. This will reduce a lot of people from experiencing all the pains from the things I just described. So why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we taking those issues seriously and providing the kids with the skills that have been demonstrated to actually keep healthy people healthy?
Yeah.
But we're not.
And that's a great question. And I guess I kind of have that question for you. Like, why do you think systems aren't doing that if we do know that it works? Like where's the disconnect there?
I think it's mostly a conceptual problem in terms of people's paradigm. People actually think about all of this whole field of mental health and addictions. They really think about it from the perspective of treatment, and they have a hard time getting their heads around believing that we can actually prevent this stuff. We've got a long history of trying to find methods that work to prevent it, and I think a lot of people have a hard time getting around that, getting their head around the idea that this is possible to do. And I think there's also an issue of political will, because there's so much demand for things like, we hear demand for more of the acute kinds of things, like better access, lower wait times, more psychiatrists, et cetera, et cetera. We hear that everywhere. And so the politicians, of course, they want to give that. So if they're going to give money, they end up giving to more of that stuff, more of the stuff we already have. And the sad fact is, and this is another little line I've been using a lot, is more of the same doesn't give us different. People are not looking for the same shit. They're looking for a change, real change, which means we got to do things really differently. We've got to do different things. And one of the different things we don't do is keep healthy people healthy. There's social and emotional learning in the schools and resilience work. We that stuff we know. Just get that into all the schools, period. It's that simple. And, write the check, because it's going to save money later. But here's the catch. It's going to save money for whoever's the next government, not your elected party in your 4 years or whatever you have. And so you see there's a political issue here, because governments tend to want to look for small, short wins, like short-term wins, because they can then say, here's what we did during our elected mandate. Well, so that approach serves the system quite nicely, right? The political, but does it serve the clients? Does it serve the public that is the client? Not at all. So, and again, that's another example of us not having a client-centered system. It's system-centric, right? And so there's so much of this that we know that if we regulated the alcohol industry differently, if we raised the age to 21, if we attached price if we attached taxation to alcohol content. So the higher the alcohol content, the higher the price of alcohol, we would actually reduce alcohol consumption. We'd reduce at least 5 types of cancer, including breast cancer, because alcohol is a class A carcinogen. We would reduce substance use and addiction problems. But so are we doing that? Not a chance. We keep doing all the wrong things with alcohol. But if we want to get at addiction in terms of keeping healthy people healthy, the secret is actually in regulation of the industry, not in education. We're not doing it because that's a politically sensitive issue.
Yeah. Do you think it's also a vulnerability issue almost, where it's like if I'm working in the system, whether I'm a political party member or if I'm even someone, who's working in the mental health system or working in the addictions field or working in an education system or wherever, if I am admitting that the system doesn't work as well as it could and should, then it's almost like is that almost a vulnerability thing for people, do you think? Where it's like, I'm part of a system that isn't working as well as it should. I don't want to admit that. So we're not going to make any changes because we're never going to admit that it's not working very well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic insight. And I've got 2 answers to that. One is, I think you're dead on from an organizational perspective, because all of our health organizations and our education organizations, all of these, they have communications departments that are not really about sharing information. They're about spinning information, right? Most of what they do is making sure that the organization looks good. And so that's why they typically report to the senior executive of the organization, right? Because that's their job. And so that's one aspect of what you just said. But the other aspect is, the answer is yes, with insecure leaders, people who should not be in leadership positions. And we have many of those in every organization. And so anybody that actually takes that approach, where they don't want to make big change and admit the fact that things are dysfunctional because that would reflect poorly on them, that's an insecure leader. That's somebody who should not be in that position. Secure leadership is somebody who's ready to say, yeah, this isn't working, and this is, this part is my fault, or this part isn't, but it doesn't matter because we have to fix it because it's what's right. And if people think that I failed somehow in the previous years by not fixing it until now, fine, but I'm fixing it now because it's right. And that's what good leadership is. And so I think you're dead on. That insecurity is a significant flaw that we have, and people try their best to stay safe and look good, and that again is system centric. That's not client centric.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I guess, kind of going along with the Amazon comment that you talked about, but also, you are very in your book, you don't pull any punches, which I think is what people really like about your book, because you're willing to, call a spade and say, this isn't working and this is what needs to be fixed and this is how to do it. And I love the how to do it part, because I think that part is so important, as opposed to just going, this doesn't work, someone's got to fix it. But have you gotten any, I guess, pushback about that? Like, any, aside from the snarky Amazon comment, have there been any? And it's, I mean, this might be an out of line question, so feel free not to answer it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what does that pushback look like for you, if you've gotten any?
I haven't gotten a overt pushback. In fact, what's been happening is that as the book grows in its reach across Canada, and it has been growing by itself. I mean, I don't have a big publishing company behind this book, and it's still sold a couple thousand books. Like, it continues to grow. And there are organizations that have taken this book on as their guidebook for their programs. And so New Brunswick, Trillium Health in Ontario, there are places that are really embracing this. But there are other organizations. I guess the pushback is just really more the lack of uptake. And so in Nova Scotia, there's a resistance to the whole idea, I can't really fully explain that, except I think some of it is about the two issues that you described earlier, about the organization making sure that it's always presenting positive stuff and never admitting flaws, and about insecure leadership, that really isn't focused with a moral compass. It's focused more from a survival compass. And that just pisses me off. I find that unethical and inappropriate when I see that happening. And but so I don't get a lot of that once in a while, but not very often. Most people who read it actually end up seeing that this just makes sense. Like, ethically and practically, it just makes sense for us to move in this direction of making things really about the people we serve. The people who need it, not about the staff, not about the management, not about the CEO or the board or the minister, or the party or the money, but let's just do what's right, because we've got too many decades of people suffering and dying and having long lives of unhappiness, when they could have had the same life of happiness if we intervened earlier, if we created services that were more accessible, and more about them. So we've got work to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I do want to ask one question that's just kind of been percolating, I guess, for me. And I'd just love to hear your take on it, because we talked a little bit about how important it is for people to get that appropriate level of care when they need it. So kind of like, if you are feeling a bit sad, but you don't have full-blown depression, but to still get help for the fact that you're feeling a bit sad. Do you think that kind of our focus, I guess, on a very biological model of mental health, which is kind of what's popular right now. We kind of had, for a while, it was a very social model where it's like, you got bipolar disorder because you were a bad person. And then it kind of swung all the way to being a very biological model where you see these like clickbait articles that are like, we can pinpoint the part in your DNA that has, depression in it or whatever it is. Do you think that biological model can sometimes work against that, because it's like, oh well, if you were sick, you would have an illness, and so we're not going to help you with this social stuff? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I'm glad to see that kind of medical progress, because it will help us a lot with the stigma side of things, right? And just generally speaking, because when we recognize that something is biological, we don't really argue it. I mean, if you think about sexual orientation, the changes in stigma that have happened in that, a lot of that has come from a realization of reality, and that is that it's a biological issue. It's not just I just decided one day I think I'd like to be that, and as we made that progress, we started to see a shift in acceptance. So there's value in that medical model, but I think that what it does is closes the door to anybody that's not yet diagnosable from a medical perspective. right? And so you're right. I mean, we shut the floodgates and keep the moat around the castle so that nobody gets in unless they qualify, unless they can show medically that they have something. And it's a serious problem, because what we really need more of is counselors and social workers who are able to do things like skill building kinds of support for people when they're starting to experience early symptoms. I mean, we know that the earlier we intervene in the progression of anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, psychotic types of disorders, depression, mood disorders, the earlier we intervene, the better the prognosis is forever. Like, it's a permanent effect that we have. And some of that is about skill building. Some of it's about more intensive work, like early psychosis programs would do. But if we don't build that, I mean, I don't know, what's the logic in not building that kind of support, where people can actually just get appointments or have drop-in sessions, have group education sessions where people are trained in things like emotion management and anxiety management, and and mindfulness to keep focus on their thoughts if they're starting to deal with manic phases of early bipolar, or with psychotic issues, or why I don't understand why we're not doing that. And I think it's mostly just because the people who tend to have the most power in the system tend to be the most medically driven, right? So they tend to be psychiatrists, and I'm not bashing psychiatrists. Some of my favorite people are psychiatrists, but that the perspective that psychiatry and medicine bring is that one of diagnostics and treatment of illness. They're not trained to keep healthy people healthy. Social workers are, counselors are, some nurses are. I mean, psychologists are not all that much. I mean, most of our professions that end up in the leadership roles are people who are trained to recognize and treat illness. And so we just need to start to shift that and get some other folks in there, so we're providing supports and skill building that keep healthy people healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know that that's really resonating with some people. I know, Winkleman has said, great speaker, worth watching. Lorrie Young, who is actually going to be our guest on the show next week, has given us a thumbs up. Love Lorrie. So I know there are lots of people watching who are going like, wow, this really resonates with me. I totally want to be a part of this paradigm shift, a part of this system change. So if they, want to reach out to you, or, read your book, or check out more about what you're doing, where can they go to do that?
A few places. If you want to just hear more of the things that I'm talking about, I've got a YouTube channel. You can find stuff on there, some videos and webinars. I've got a website. The easiest way to remember it is www.itsnotaboutus.ca. So okay. The title of the book, It's Not About Us. And feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's Todd Leader1. On Instagram, Todd Leader. On Facebook, I've got It's Not About Us page as well. And anyone interested in having me as a speaker somewhere, or consulting work, or anything like that, just reach out through any of those, or just Google me. You'll find my website itself anyway.
Okay. So I'll put some links to those in the comments as well.
Excellent. And the book's available online at Chapters Indigo, or at Amazon, or at itsnotaboutus.ca. If you want a signed copy, you got to go to itsnotaboutus.ca. That's mine. And of course, if I sign it, that makes it worth like $3 less.
Or they just have to run into you at a conference and then like beg you to sign their copy. I'm going to be there like, will you sign my Kindle? Like, that'll be me. Yeah.
And if people follow me, I'm actually planning to promote a special, like a sale on the books, actually, a special in sometime in the next week or so. So if people follow me on social media, you'll actually see an ad for that, where I'm going to knock some money off and try and blow some out to people to give them a break. So. All
right, awesome. And then they've got their summer reading all lined up, which is perfect. And then they can hit the ground running in September and change those systems. That's fabulous.
This is about building an army with the same message, right? We've all got so many messages trying to advocate for change, but this was about trying to take the inside tips and give us all the same message, so we're saying the same things, because the message gets stronger then.
Absolutely, and having that focus is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Todd, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've been amazing and so insightful. And this is a lot of fun for me.
Excellent. Well, we'll do it again then.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
thank you everyone who tuned in. Thank you everyone who left comments. If this episode resonated with you, like feel free to share it on Facebook. If you are thinking, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun, I would love to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can join my mailing list, and I will put a link to that in the comments as well. Other than that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Todd. And I will see all of you next week when I'll be interviewing the New Brunswick Provincial Peer Support Consultant, Lorrie Young. All right, take care, everyone.